On my video about Lacey Fletcher, the well, not young lady, the 36-year-old woman that essentially was neglected to death, that suffered from autism spectrum disorder in Louisiana, someone had commented in the comments section that they believed that perhaps the autism was faked. Perhaps, I would assume by the parents, they mean to cover up a murder and neglect. I don't believe so. They said that they don't believe that autism generally gets worse with age. It might not generally get worse with age, but it certainly does get worse with age readily enough that it is fairly common that autism symptoms get worse with age. Okay, so I didn't work with too many autistic people when I worked in mental health, okay? But I want to be sure that people understand. Most of the people I worked with were literally mentally challenged. I did have a couple autistic clients, but to be quite honest, I didn't. They just were nerds like that. I really didn't even notice anything that bad. Like their symptoms were fairly under control. They knew how to control their symptoms. They knew how to navigate society pretty good. They were just quirky. So what I'm gonna leave links in the description showing what I'm going to say in this video. So essentially, one thing that autism doesn't do is it doesn't generally go away. Okay, so people with autism as a child sometimes will have improvements as they grow older. If you remember the Lacey Fletcher video that I made, which there will be a link in the description to the Lacey Fletcher video that I made, and in that video's description there are links to various videos that other people made to give different perspectives on the Lacey Fletcher case. What caused her state of what would be called autistic catatonia was essentially what autistic catatonia is. Let me get into this. So catatonia is a state where a person becomes catatonic. Well, what does that mean? They become belligerent, they become rigid, they become sometimes aggressive, sometimes very compliant. Sometimes, with autism, a lot of times they will become mute. They won't be able to speak. They shut down. Things of this nature, which is exactly the behaviors that were described that Lacey Fletcher was exhibiting for 12 years as she defecated and urinated in a sofa and smeared feces and urine all over herself as she slowly rotted to death in a sofa. Okay? So these are signs of autistic catatonia. Now, autism and schizophrenia used to be thought to be the same thing, and that's one of the reasons is because autism, turning in on oneself, is one of the symptoms of schizophrenia. And I'm going to leave links in the description showing this. There's also similar gene clusters. I'm not a big believer in the genetic theory of mental illness because I don't think it really pans out, but there are similar gene clusters for schizophrenia and autism and intellectual deficiency. So you have gene clusters for all of those things that seem to be related, but like I said, I'm not a big believer with mental retardation or intellectual deficiency. I do believe that there is a large genetic factor because you're diagnosing something that is literally IQ oriented, and of course we know that the IQ is like 80 to 85% genetic, so of course genes are going to play a major role because heredity obviously plays a major role in the level of one's IQ. However, with schizophrenia and autism, the issue there is people can have quite high IQs and come from families with quite high IQs. So heredity, and the other thing is when you really look at the genetic factors in schizophrenia. Now, I want to be sure people understand this. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a mental health professional. Blah 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 blah. This video is for entertainment purposes only. But when you really look at the genetic factors, it's not really that much of an increased risk compared to the general public, unless it's like your parent, and even then, it's not a super high increased risk. So my point is that the genetic factors I don't really think pan out, but what is interesting is, as I have stated, orthomolecular psychiatry, which was created by a gentleman named Dr. Abraham Hoffer, and his adrenochrome theory of schizophrenia. uh, he really came a long way with treating schizophrenia with nutrition. But what I want to point out is this. So, as I said, autism doesn't go away when somebody gets older, okay? In some cases, in the elderly, it will get worse, okay? But the thing that you have to remember is with Lacey Fletcher, her autism symptoms got worse when she began to be homeschooled. Probably because the stressors increased, the isolation increased, the lack of having friends her own age increased, the lack of socialization increased, the lack of connection to reality increased. So she probably turned in on herself due to the stress and due to the lack of reality checking, because there was no reality to check. There was nobody to check her reality. Clearly, her parents, I don't care what anybody says, they shouldn't get away with what they did, but clearly these two people really had issues with reality checking themselves. They clearly were not mentally well. I actually do believe that they're crazy enough to think that she actually was mentally and emotionally competent to make her own decisions. I actually do think that. Because, as I said, when I worked in mental health, I've met with people. I've been to people's homes. I've talked to the parents of mentally challenged people. I've talked to the families of mentally challenged people. And they swear that their loved ones are perfectly competent to make their own decisions and that they want them to have autonomy and they want this and they want that and da-da-da-da-da. And it's just not the case. It's not a healthy way for people to be. People in that situation need more help than other people. Like, for example, major depressive disorder is a hell of a lot different than severe autism, okay? Especially when you're having a crisis, when you're shutting down. Major bipolar disorder is a hell of a lot different than what do you call it? Than intellectual deficiency. Bipolar disorder, unless it has psychotic features, is a hell of a lot different than, say, schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. Certain people need extra help, especially if they're going through crisis. So what you have to understand is this bout of catatonia that was experienced by Lacey Fletcher probably was brought on by environmental stressors, as well as internal stressors and a lack of reality checking. Because if you have two people that are this insane, like it was considered that the mother actually sat down in a chair next to the couch where her daughter was living in her own feces and urine and was watching television next to her daughter. It was also stated that she would clean the girl's wound. I don't know how true that is, but she would clean the girl's wounds. Mind you, this girl had insect bites and insects living in her body for years, but allegedly the mother would clean her pressure ulcers, which is a fancy word for bed sores, and didn't think anything of it. Didn't think anything was absurd or weird or bizarre, okay? And it wasn't that they didn't ask a doctor what to do. Apparently they did ask a doctor what to do, and the doctor told them to bring her to the hospital. But that was years prior. That was many years prior, like 12 years prior or more. I forget exactly. It's mentioned in one of the videos in the description of my video on Lacey Fletcher. But I mean, you're talking about years of this, and the parents obviously didn't think that whatever, they were either too crazy, which is what I'm thinking, or too embarrassed, which is another thing that probably is true, but I think it was more so the crazy, because you don't do something like that unless you're absolutely batshit insane. Like that's the thing, it doesn't mean they should get away with it. You have to understand, did they understand the wrongness of what they're doing? Well, clearly they must have, because they did call the doctor. Did they understand the wrongness of what they were doing throughout the whole situation? That I don't know, and that's a sticky situation, and I hope it doesn't allow them to get away with this, because this is absolutely disgusting. But make a long story short, the reason I made this video is, yes, autism symptoms can get worse with age. but they definitely get worse with an increase in environmental stressors. Okay, and that's what people need to remember is her long-standing bout of autistic catatonia. And that's the other thing. We'll find out when this goes to trial if she snapped in and out of catatonia, if the catatonia lifted to certain degrees or other degrees. Like, we'll find that out as this goes to trial. But Jesus Christ, I mean, the whole case is absolutely just bizarre. It is bizarre. But like I said, if you work with people with similar conditions to this, people that I think have more similar conditions to Lacey Fletcher that I've dealt with are actually people with schizophrenia. I had one gentleman on my caseload that was an Indian gentleman, and he exhibited very similar behavior to that, not like the feces smearing and all that, but the catatonia and the belligerence and the agreeableness and the different symptoms of catatonia. Catatonia is obviously present in both schizophrenia and in autism. And of course, you can have catatonia as long as you don't check all the boxes. You don't meet the requirements for this disorder or that disorder. But my point is more of the people that I worked with that had more similar situations to Lacey were actually the schizophrenics than the autistic people. I mean, the schizophrenics, well, yes, then the autistic people I had very, very few symptoms, really. Very minor issues, probably because they were good at what's called masking. But the schizophrenics I had, a lot of the schizophrenics I had did have symptoms similar to Lacey Fletcher, though not to the degree because they were actually in treatment. And even though I'm not really a big fan of mental health treatment, when it makes you get out of bed and it makes you associate with normal people, not normal people, but when it makes you associate with people and you have people that you can reality check against and things like this, when you have a psychotic disorder or a delusional strain of thinking like these people tend to have, well, that's a good thing. That is a good thing, okay? And that's what people need to keep in mind, is these are good things when people have people to reality check against and things like that. So that's what people need to keep in mind. This is what was taken away from her when she was homeschooled. She didn't have people to reality check with. She didn't have people to say, hey, you're acting kind of weird. She didn't have a teacher or a friend to call the authorities to make sure she was okay, because that was all taken away from her when she was homeschooled. And that's what I find particularly disgusting and disturbing about this. But yeah, to close it out, of course, autism can get worse with age, but more likely it wasn't age that made it get worse. It was more so the stressors that made it get worse and the isolation that made it get worse. And that's all for this video.